All right, Paul, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on Being Flynn. Saw the movie a couple weeks ago. I thought it was great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Especially the performances.
Great.
Mr. DeNiro and Paul Dano were especially good together. I thought their relationship was obviously central, but
Great, thanks. Yeah, you know, Bob obviously is an iconic figure, and in this case it's a guy who's kind of haunted by this dad who he never knew and who shows up in this very dramatic fashion in his life. And in real, it's based on a memoir. It's a true story of this poet Nick Flynn, who when he was in his 20s worked at a homeless shelter, and his dad, he had been in prison and was this sort of massively egotistical fellow who considers himself one of the 3 great writers that America's ever produced. Yeah. Anyway, his dad was an alcoholic who ended up losing his taxi driving license and showed up to live in the shelter where Paul was working. Sorry, where Nick Flynn was working. Mm-hmm. And it was this weird way in which Nick Flynn got to know his dad. was right. You know, Nick had this job working at this homeless shelter, which sounds kind of grim, but actually at that time in his life was a great job for him. He was really troubled at the time and having his own issues with sort of like self-destructiveness essentially. And he found something he was really good at and something that was intense enough to really occupy his attention. Right. And then his dad showed up. And I really like the fact that in this case that Bob is so famous an actor and associated with these great roles because there's an immediate sort of mythic stature that he has. Yeah. And I thought that this was one of the roles where actually that was a good thing. Right. Because it's Bob DeNiro showing up and you know, as Paul Dano's dad. And in terms of Paul, I was really excited because, you know, I'd seen him act opposite Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood and Ballad of Jack and Rose. And Daniel Day-Lewis is apparently quite an intimidating dude. I haven't actually met him.
I would imagine. Yeah.
But I knew that Paul was able to stand up to him, and I thought he would not only be able to act with De Niro, but would be able to challenge him essentially.
Right.
So yeah, I think that was I was really happy to have the two of them together.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. I wondered about the adaptation. You're no stranger to adapting a novel into a screenplay.
Yeah, my brother Chris and I adapted the book About a Boy, and it's a strange thing with adaptation because I really feel like to be true to a novel or a memoir, you actually have to diverge from the book itself in order to be true to it. Because there's just no way to do it. There's just too much stuff in a book to fit into an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours. Right. So you're presented with this weird catch-22, which is this is not going to work if I'm utterly true to it. So the lucky thing here was it was Nick Flynn's memoir, and when I first met Nick, I said, I need to do something, which I need to be talking to you about a character named Nick Flynn. And right. I can't say you, and you can't say I when we're talking about this. And then I proceeded over the course of 7 years to write literally 30 drafts of the script. Wow. I wasn't sure it was ever going to get made, but I knew it was interesting to me to reapproach it each time. Right. And Nick was masochistic enough to read each of the 30 drafts and kind enough to be really supportive throughout the whole process. So he kind of gave me his blessing to have the character do and say things that both weren't in the memoir and hadn't happened in his life, but that were what was going to make the movie be cohesive and be actually true to the book. Right. And weirdly now, you know, I also both Bob and I really wanted him around all the time, especially when we were shooting stuff at the homeless shelter, so that he could tell us if something was BS or not. Right. So I got him to put his life on hold and actually be there. And he was always like this sort of good spirit over the production. Yeah. He's also married to Lily Taylor, who's a wonderful actor who's in the film. Yeah. So I think he knows a little bit about like the weirdness of the filmmaking process and the ups and downs of it. That's good. So yeah, and now Nick's written a book which is going to come out next January, I think, about the weird experience of having written a memoir about his life and then having a film made about the memoir. Yeah, so
cool.
Yeah.
Was it daunting at all to adapt a real life memoir as opposed to a novel like About a Boy?
Well, it was utterly daunting. I mean, in the first place, it's daunting to adapt a book. In the case of About a Boy, actually, the last third of that movie is different from the book. The book has this weird sort of thing where Kurt Cobain commits suicide. The book is completely full of references to Nirvana.
Right, like the title.
First off, yeah, we knew we literally were not going to be able to afford to put those songs in the movie. And second off, it felt like it was diverging from the central two characters. So we ended up taking this risk and doing a whole new ending, which luckily Nick Hornby ended up liking.
Right.
Also, one key thing with that was we chose Valley Drawn Boy to do the music for About a Boy, and actually, this is the first time I worked with Damon Goff, whose stage name is Valley Drawn Boy, is on this film Being Flynn. Damon wrote songs and did all the score for this movie as well. And in the case of About a Boy, Nick Hornby is such a music snob that and he loved Valley Drawn Boy. So when we chose that artist to do all the music, he thought, well, maybe these guys aren't going to screw it up.
Cool.
And but yeah, it's even more daunting when it's somebody's real life. And
Right.
without Nick Flynn being such a good guy, I don't know how I would have done it, essentially.
Right. It's also clear from your work that you're very interested in family and family dynamics. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in particular, I'm interested in the question of, for me, it's about my dad, who was a really wonderful, loving person, and also, in some ways, an utter maniac. And for me, it's a question of, throughout my life, how much am I my own person, and how much am I inheriting my personality from my dad? And that's something that, on a survival level, Nick Flynn is dealing with in the course of his memoir and in the course of this story. It's really a battle between the two guys. When Bob's character shows up in the homeless shelter, it's not sort of abjectly with hat in hand. It's with a weird swagger. He shows up and Nick is handing out tickets to the guys for their bed for the evening, which is in a big room with 100 beds in it.
Right.
And his dad shows up and said, I'd like a room for the evening. And Nick is kind of shocked and says, well, we don't give out rooms, you can have a bed. And his dad said, well, when one opens up, if you have the clout, I'd appreciate it. Yeah. I'm really interested in the question actually of like mentoring and the idea that it's not just love that you get from somebody who's a towering figure in your life. If it's going to be effective, there are some cruel truths that are going to be conveyed to you. And it's kind of, in this movie, it's too late for Nick to sort of want even love from his dad. But there's something that his dad needs to give him, which is basically something about survival. Because Paul Dano and his character's dad was just out of control, narcissistic alcoholic, and his mom was a really wonderful single mother, played by Julianne Moore in the movie, but who ended up killing herself later on in life. And so there's really no model for him to figure out how to be the kind of person he wants to become. Right. And he has this huge guilt over what happened to his mother, and it's attached to his own writing because his mother read this short story he wrote, pretty much about her, right before she did it. And on some level, what he needs from his dad is to figure out how he proceeds from there. And DeNiro's character basically is the only person who can tell him, like, you're not me and you're not your mother. You're a survivor. But the weird thing is that, like, Nick's dad in real life, Jonathan Flynn, is an utter survivor. It's crazy. And part of what helped him survive was this narcissistic delusion that he's a great writer. Actually went with DeNiro and Nick to go visit his dad and to go hang out at the shelter where Nick worked. But when Jonathan Flynn met DeNiro, he said to him, well, you think you can pull this off? He was completely certain of himself. Wow. And Nick said, well, Dad, he was in The Godfather, like, he's a very respected actor. And he said, yeah, you're good, but you think you can pull this part off? Playing me? And also, I'm pretty certain that Jonathan, part of the way he processed the fact that he was, in his own mind, a great writer but never was published, and his son ended up being a very well-respected poet and writer, is that he owns it. It's on some level his book because he created his son. Right. And there are some just basic questions about survival that Nick learns from his dad in the course of this.
Very cool. I wondered if you could talk about working with Mr. DeNiro. I know you've worked with him before, and
he was actually he was a producer on About a Boy, and one of the things that we contended with early on was in About a Boy, the little boy his mother's depressed, and he's in a really grim situation in the beginning of the movie, and comes out of it through his friendship with Hugh Grant. But a lot of the stuff we shot first was the little boy being pretty sad, and the studio saw the dailies and said, "God, you got this kid who seems like he's depressed." And he said, "Well, it's appropriate to the part of the movie," and they were really giving us a hard time, and so we called up DeNiro and said, "Will you please look at the dailies and see if you agree with us that he's great?" And he saw them, and he called the studio and said, "The kid's a good actor, like, leave the guys alone."
Right.
So he was helpful, actually, as a producer on that movie, and I, to some degree, kept in touch, and luckily, he read the script and not only liked it, but liked it and was inspired enough by it to stay attached to it for a number of years and to do it at a very low budget range. And he worked incredibly hard on it, and it was really beautiful to me to see sort of the respect that he brought to the craft.
Right.
And it's really fun directing Bob, because he has a sort of a bit of a childish sense of humor, as do I, and also, like, look, he's Robert De Niro. I'm not going to be in any form teaching him how to act. But so, like, the first note that I gave him on this was, it's a part of the movie where the character has lost his cab license from being drunk and ramming his cab into something, and he's walking down the courthouse steps after knowing that he has no place to sleep that night because he's been living in his cab. And I said, and he's in his voiceover, he's saying, I'm going to put this into my book, Memoirs of a Moron. And I said to Bob, how about if you lift your arms in mock triumph when you think that? And Bob looked at me and went, I don't know. It was like his first day of shooting. He was like, this is my first day. I don't really want to go over the top with this. And I said, don't do it. Just do whatever feels natural. And then, oh God, my first note to Bob in this movie was a bad note. And so then every scene after that, I would say to him, that was great. Now how about if you lift your arms and mock triumph at the end of this? And we would just laugh about it. So
that's great.
He's great, and it's great sort of feeling that you're working with somebody who's such a huge part of the art form, and they're essentially at the top of their game in terms of what they're bringing to it.
Great. All right, great. Well, Paul, it was great meeting you.
Congratulations
again on the film, and
thank you.
good luck.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks.